Following program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts.
About money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared on the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
It's Friday afternoon, and we're going to be talking about money. When I started this radio program back in October of 2008, I started at that time when we were dipping down. We were in the middle of a crisis, in the middle of the Great Recession. And the first year or so was a talk about the theme, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, that either everything was going to go to zero or things were going to recover. But for the last 5 years or so, I've been talking about two themes. And I want to add to that a third theme today. But the two themes, let me review where we were. For the past 5 years, I've been talking about a supercycle. It was a study done by the bank in the UK, Standard Chartered Bank of the UK. They had 80,000 employees. They did a study and they found that world GDP had certain times when the GDP grew faster than average. The first of those times was 1873 to 1913. It was a time that was driven by the industrialization of the United States. When we began to industrialize, when we went through those very tough times, and in 1874 we went through a time very similar to 2008, it lasted much longer. The government didn't step in and put money into the system. It lasted almost 30 years, but we converted from an agricultural nation to an industrial nation. And not only did we do that, but that drove the entire world GDP up. We moved the center, the financial center, from the Europeans to the United States, where it still exists. That was the first supercycle. GDP grew faster than average for that period of time. The second supercycle came 1945 to 1970, which was driven primarily by the rebuilding of Europe after World War II. But it also affected a lot of the colonial nations. We saw the colonial nations become independent. In the U.S., we saw a whole infrastructure built, the highway system, the airports. It was a significant time for growth worldwide. And Standard Chartered Bank said that in 2009, we were beginning another supercycle, a supercycle that was going to be driven by the emerging nations, those developing nations. And the forecasts are that by 2030, 93% of the world's middle class will be in those emerging nations, those developing nations. They've moved from a subsistence living to actually becoming consumers. And of course, in terms of middle class, there's a very wide spread. But essentially what a middle class person is someone that's consuming. They're buying lattes, they're buying clothes. They're not just existing on what they can produce in their own gardens. So beginning in 2009, we started to see a worldwide supercycle begin. And that supercycle, I believe, is going to continue for some time. I believe that's a concept or a theme which you can rely on for the next 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 years. The second theme I began to talk about 5 years ago was Dow 100,000. I talked about it for comparing it to the history, looking at the Dow going back to the 1900s, early 1900s through 1941 to 1966, from 1982 through 2000. It was a time in which we saw the stock market grow. And I made the comparison between 1982 and the concerns in 1982 when we saw that big run from the Dow going from 1,000 to 14,000. We saw a lot to worry about in 1982. We had just come out of a bout of very, very high inflation. There was concern about inflation. There were concerns about the federal deficit and the trade deficit as well. There was a concern about slowing profit margins by corporations. There was concern about runaway monetary policy by the Fed. Concern about oil prices that had skyrocketed from $10 a barrel to $40 a barrel at that time, quadrupling from where they were. There was a concern about economic growth, which had been close to zero during this period of time. Zero at the very most, 2.5%. Sounds almost like we are today, doesn't it? There was a concern about federal tax policy, and there was a concern about federal entitlements, about Social Security. There was a concern that we were going to be bankrupt because of our Social Security system. Sounds almost like we were today, but that was a time in which the stock market in August of 82 hit 1,000, the same number that it had been in 1966 before it went down 20% and then back to 1,000, down 30%, back to 1,000, down 40%, back to 1,000, down 20%, and then in August of 82 it hit 1,000, and it kept on going till it hit 14,000 in March of 2000. And of course, we all remember what's happened since 2000. So that was a tenfold or even a greater than a tenfold increase. But there's a book that just was released called Bold, and I want to draw information from that as well as The Economist, as well as the Wall Street Journal, Investment News. And I want to take you back to a time. I want to take you into a history of a company. Began in 1878, a guy by the name of George Eastman. He was just 24 years old. He was a junior clerk in the Rochester Savings Bank, wanted to take a vacation, decided he was going to go to the Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo, and he wanted to record the trip. He wanted to record it on, today we would call that on film, so he got a huge camera, a camera that was very large, a big tripod. When you think of those old pictures made about the old Wild West, it was that kind of thing. He needed a big water jug because had to carry his own water, and very heavy plate holders because what you recorded on were very heavy plates. He needed some glass tanks to develop and chemicals, and then he needed a very large tent because he needed a dark area, a dark room, essentially. It was all a wet process. You would take a picture, then you had to take the plate, you had to develop it, and eventually print it off. It was a chemical process, and it was a wet process. Well, George Eastman never took that trip. He got so involved in getting the materials to plan for the trip. But he also began to realize that this was a really tough process. And he began to play around in his own kitchen, and he developed a dry chemical processing. He continued to work on that, and it took him a couple years to get to a dry process with a machine that would process it. And he formed a company because now he had a new process, a new technology. It was the Eastman Dry Plate Company. But he didn't stop there. He continued to develop, and he developed a roll of film. 1884, 6 years later, he had a film, but he didn't have a camera. The camera was to come in 1888. A camera that would actually use a roll of film and take pictures. He set up the saying, you press the button and we do the rest. It was all straightforward. Eastman Kodak Company. He really wanted, however, a more catchy name than Eastman Company. And he liked the letter K. He really liked the letter K. So in 1892, he formed the Eastman Kodak Company. There was no Kodak. He just liked the letter K. And in 1892, if you would have asked George Eastman how he viewed his company, and he reported how he viewed it, it was a chemical supply company and a dry goods purveyor. It was not a camera company. But he soon began to realize in the late 1890s and into the early 1900s that it was a photography company. Photography was an everyday affair. The saying moved to make it as convenient as a pencil. That was his thing. And for the next 100 years, Eastman Kodak did that, made it as convenient as using a pencil. So if you fast forward to 1973, there's another story that comes into play because there was a young engineer who had just graduated from Rensselaer Polytech RPI, and he got an engineering job at Kodak. And as he started his work, he had a boss that came to him, and his boss asked for a small request, a very small request. His boss said Fairchild Semiconductor had developed a charge-coupled device, CCD device. And he wanted to know if there was an easy way to move an electronic charge around a transistor and to use that for imaging. Now, transistor in those days, in 1973, they were fairly large. They were, what, half an inch by an inch, that size? But he wanted to know if he could actually build a device for imaging. And Sasson used the CCDs to make the first digital camera. It was the first and digital recording device. It was described as like being a 1970s Polaroid with a speak and spell. The camera itself was the size of a toaster, almost 2 feet long. It was wide. It was clumsy. It weighed 8.5 pounds, and it produced 1/100th of a megapixel. Now, you want to hear the rest of the story, and we're coming up to a commercial break. There is a lot of the rest of the story, and I'm going to show you how it applies. So don't go away. Be right back.
About Money will resume in a moment with Mike Adams on Business Radio 1300 KKOL. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Lots of people manage investment portfolios. Just a few can manage a successful portfolio and provide exceedingly great service to their clients. Here's Mike Adams from Adams Financial Concepts.
We believe the price you pay should be based on the performance of your portfolio and the quality of service you receive.
You know, Mike, it seems that a lot of companies subscribe to the one-size-fits-all mentality of investing. Does one size really fit all?
Not with us. Every portfolio that we manage is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. We place our clients' interests first in all portfolio decisions.
If you're looking for a home for your 7-figure plus investment portfolio, call Mike Adams of Adams Financial Concepts, specializing in creating and maintaining wealth for over 20 years. 206-903-1019. That's 206-903-1019. Or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com. You can even listen to
About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I've been talking about the Eastman Kodak Company. Going back to the 1800s, at the end of the 1800s, it grew. And in 1973, developed the first digital camera. It was a very crude device, 8.5 pounds. It was big. It was clumsy. Produced really grainy pictures. You know, it just wasn't very exciting, but it was the first digital camera. And it would record not to a plate or not to film, but to a cassette tape. That's how they recorded the pictures. So now you fast forward to 1996. Eastman Kodak Company now employed, by 1996, 140,000 people. They had a $28 billion market cap. They effectively had a monopoly on the film market. 90% of the film market was Kodak film. 85% of the camera market. The cameras were produced by Kodak. And Kodak viewed their business as a photographic business. Their desire to record, instead of viewing what they were doing as a desire to record our lives, as capturing the moment, as recording those key events and times in our life. Instead of that, they viewed their business as being in the photography business. Their business, in fact, was the film business. It was recording images on rolls of film. And they completely missed the digital camera business. As the digital camera came on, it undercut that business. It undercut the chemicals, the photographic film business, because they didn't see how a very grainy photo taken on a very big camera that was weighty and clumsy could ever displace those cameras and the film that they were making. Instead of realizing that they could dominate the digital camera market, the digital film market, instead of realizing that that's what they could use their clout and their dominance for, they stuck with their regular business. And you know what happened? Today they're in bankruptcy. Today they have a huge problem because they have so many retired people that those who work in the Kodak chemical business can't support the pension funds and the healthcare process. That is what Kodak became. You know, it's an insight as to what's going on. There was a study that was done by Professor Richard Foster that said that in the 1920s, the companies that formed in the 1920s had an average life of 67 years. So if it was formed in 1920, the average expected life of a company was 67 years. Today, the average life is 15 years. That's how long companies are expected to exist. The forecast is that by 2025, 3/4 of the companies that will be in the S&P 500 do not exist today. They'll be brand new companies. Babson School of Business out of Boston says that by 2025, 40% of today's top companies will no longer exist by 2025. Their earnings will be gone, their markets will be gone, and they'll be replaced by new companies. You know, the last couple of weeks I've talked about what value do you get if you take a penny, or how much would you have if you took a penny and doubled it every day for 30 days. I've asked the listeners to guess what that value would be. You know, the fact is, it's $11 million total. But half of that comes on the last day, 3/4 comes on the last 2 days, and over 90% on the last 4 days. It's an exponential curve. It's one of those curves that takes off. It looks like a straight line for a long time, and then it just starts to take off. You don't realize what it's doing until you reach the knuckle of the curve, the knee of the curve. So how does all this apply? Let me tell you how I think it applies. The new theme that I want to talk about. If you look at the Dow Industrial Average, on January 1st, 1990, the Dow stood at 66. By October of 29, it had reached almost 400. So in those 29 years, from the beginning of that century until 1929, 29 years, the Dow increased almost 7 times, sevenfold. 1941, the Dow was 100, and by 1966, it reached 1,000, a tenfold increase in 25 years. The Dow hit 1,000 once again in 1982, and by March of 2000 was at 14,000. So in those 18 years, it increased 14-fold. So think about this. As we began the 20th century, it took 29 years for the Dow to increase a little less than 7 times. From 1941 to 1966, in 25 years, the Dow increased 10 times. From 1982 to 2000, in 18 years, it increased 14 times. You know, if you look at the pattern, the times have become shorter and the increases have become larger. That's an exponential curve. We talk about curves that are linear, that go straight, but this is not a curve that's going straight. It's a curve that's increasing over time. Is that where we're headed with this secular bull market? I've talked about 100,000 based on a straight line, but could we be headed to Dow 200,000? or 250,000? It's very possible. And those companies, many of the large companies that we have today are going to be gone, and many of the new companies are not going to, that don't exist today, will be part of the Dow, will be part of the Standard & Poor's 500. But it's not just a concept that makes a difference. It's entrepreneurship that makes a difference. And there are companies that are at the base and that are growing. My focus in the program is to give you, the listener, insight into industries, into companies, and to be ahead of the curve rather than behind the curve. And that's the purpose of today's program, too. I have two guests who are here today that can give you some real insight into an entrepreneurial organization. Entrepreneurship is what will drive the market, which will drive the GDP. My guests today are Kevin Maude of B47 and Jim Neal of JG Neal and Company. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Good afternoon.
So, one of you needs to start first. Tell us about a little bit about your background and your company.
Sure. Our company was started in 1973. We're a second-generation food service brokerage company. So we provide local sales and marketing services for about 36 different food service manufacturers. And my brother and I bought the company in 1998. My brother and I and an office manager, and 17 years later, we've grown at about 13x. So maybe we're on that similar curve. I don't know.
You're working on the curve.
Working on it. We're working on it. And we have offices Seattle, Spokane, and Portland, and offer our services throughout the entire Pacific Northwest up through Washington, Oregon, Alaska, North Idaho, Western Montana.
That's Jim Neal. And quite an accomplishment to grow his company 13 times over in that number of years. And we're going to hear more about, but we'll get there. Kevin.
Yeah, my company is B47 Studios. We're a creative video production company here in Seattle, but we service clients around the world. We're a 14-year-old company. We've grown from a service-based primarily, and now we're focusing on original content and service-based business. So we're developing TV series, web series, but still servicing clients from webcasting to product promotion and case study kind of videos that ultimately end up online or in a broadcast fashion.
Two very successful entrepreneurs, two very successful companies, but they also belong to an organization called Entrepreneurial Organization. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, at the largest level, EO, or the Entrepreneurs Organization, is a global network of entrepreneurs. We have chapters in 48 different countries, over 10,000 members worldwide, and the organization was founded in 1998, roughly.
Yeah, I think so.
And so it's unique in the sense that it's designed for entrepreneurs and owners of businesses versus other business organizations that are out there, and we'll talk a little bit about that later.
So when you talk about business owners, what are the requirements to belong to this organization?
So to be a member of the organization, your business needs to be hitting $1 million in revenue. And then also you have to be controlling interest in your company on a day-to-day basis. So those are primarily the two requirements from a global standpoint. And then from a chapter standpoint, we really look at members that are really looking to grow grow themselves both in a business but also on a personal level.
So that's interesting on a personal level. Let's talk about what the purpose of EO is. It's not just an organization to join to put on your resume. It really has a purpose.
Yeah, I mean, the mission on a large level is to engage leading entrepreneurs to learn and grow. And we really do that in several different ways. One of the biggest ways is a forum experience that we hold on a local level as well as all the other local chapters. And what that is a gathering of 8 to 10 other like-minded members that are non-competitive with each other that they can learn and grow from. And there's also ways that they hold you accountable in that group, because oftentimes as an owner of a company, you're not accountable to anybody other than yourself. So through the forum experience, you're really growing and learning.
We're going to come back and talk about the forum experience. We're going to come to a commercial break now, so don't go away. You want to hear what they have to say. This is the base of what grows this company, and it creates the jobs. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
More about money coming up with Mike Adams on Business Radio 1300 KKOL. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Creating and maintaining wealth has been the specialty of Adams Financial Concepts for over 20 years. Every portfolio managed by Adams Financial Concepts is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. The client's interest always comes first in portfolio decisions. Call Mike Adams today at 206-903-1019 or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com to check out their AFC performance. They welcome your review. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Now we return to About Money. There's more information waiting for you at adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here again is your host, Mike Adams.
So we're here. I'm talking with Jim Neal and Kevin Mudd about the entrepreneurial organization. We just had started to talk about the forums. So let's come back and talk about the forums and what they actually do and what is discussed.
Yeah, so the forum experience really is an opportunity to meet with similar peers. And as entrepreneurs and business owners, a lot of times we don't have a group of people that we can talk to about the issues that go on. Certainly, employees aren't always the best ones to talk to, and sometimes at home, it's not the best place to bring home all the garbage that we sometimes deal with. And so this gives us an environment with a high level of confidentiality, where we're able to be honest and deliver what we refer to as the 5%, the top 5% of what's going on in our world and what's the bottom 5% of our world, and to be transparent. Kevin had mentioned or talked about earlier, one of the things that we look for, and there's those baselines to be a member of the organization in terms of having controlling interest or being a founder and revenue numbers. But really what we're looking for are people and business entrepreneurs who are willing to be honest, that are willing to be raw and talk about not only the things that have made them successful, but the failures that they've made along the way, and how that can be of value to others in their forum in terms of avoiding some of those things. And it's all done through an experience share versus telling people what they should or shouldn't do. It's all done through experience sharing, and it makes it a very powerful opportunity to learn from each other and to share. So to give you an example of something that might come up, you might have a forum mate who has two business partners, and he's in alignment with one of his business partners, but not a third, and they're trying to figure out exactly how are they going to work through this strategic initiative that they're working on, where they got a third partner who's not carrying their weight. And from a business standpoint, it needs to be addressed, and so that might be an issue that he would bring to his forum, and they would have a presentation around that, and they'd have an opportunity to discuss it, and then going around, instead of being told, hey, this is what you should do, it would be, I was in a similar situation, and this is how I handled it, and this is, and somebody might have a positive outcome with that story, and another person might have a story that didn't end so well, and these are the pitfalls that you could avoid, and certainly would recommend not running down that road, because we wasted time, money, and energy. Three resources no entrepreneur wants to waste.
I've heard it said, and I can't remember the source, but somebody said, what you do in a small business, if you want to be successful, is you fail, but you fail forward all the time. And I know, I run a business too, and there's a lot of things that go wrong. It isn't just a time of having a good time. There's a lot of things that go wrong, and it's how you face those problems and correct those.
Yeah, every entrepreneur has a journey that they go on. And it's nice to have somebody who's maybe been down the path that you're now walking down, and the individuals returning can share information about what's ahead.
Yeah.
And too often as entrepreneurs, and I know before I got into this organization, a lot of times I just was walking down roads and had no idea, and quite honestly, I didn't have the wherewithal to think to ask those individuals that I passed that were coming back. And had I done that, and prior to joining this organization, it certainly would have saved me a lot of headaches. Kevin's nodding his head because I think he's been in that same one. So it's been fantastic from that standpoint. And it's not just business. It's about personal growth. And there's three things we talk about. We talk about our businesses, we talk about our personal lives, and we talk about our family lives. Kevin, you wanted to...
Yeah, I mean, I think we really focus on making the entrepreneur as an individual grow and learn from others that have been there, and then also contributing back, because it's very much a community that gives and receives, and it's what you put into it, you really get out of it tenfold.
So you talked about the example of the partners. What other kind of things might come up during the forums, maybe on a personal level?
Yeah, so from a personal level, there's all kinds of things that could come up. A good example is, new parents that might be dealing with kids, and how you can deal with kids or their schooling, and picking out the right school for your kid to set them up for success down the road. Being an entrepreneur, you might not feel that you have as much time to research that, or where are some of the ideas that you might have looked for that. And, oftentimes in the forum setting, we end up talking about, these are some of the qualifications that I looked at when I was trying to decide what kind of schooling I wanted for my kids. And it kind of gives an insight into how people position that.
So the organization exists worldwide. How do you connect with other businesses that are outside of the area, or do you?
Well, the connectivity is a small part of what EO is all about. The first is to create those peer-to-peer relationships that I mentioned, and opportunities for learning and things like that. So out of that organization, the Seattle chapter, which I'm currently the president of, and Kevin's our communications chair for, we have what I would argue are 135 of the most influential entrepreneurs in the city of Seattle. They're business owners. They're actively involved in their business. They're not hired guns. We're the ones that are, as you talked about, where the economy's going. There's probably a couple of those inside of our organization. And so really for us, it's about having 135 peers, 135 of the best and brightest entrepreneurs in the city of Seattle, the ability for those people to network together. But not from a solicitation standpoint, but again, from that experience share. What is it that you've learned in your business model, and how could I translate that to mine, and how can that help me go from being a company that's growing at 2 and 3 and 4 and 5% a year to 18, 19%? Is there a strategy in terms of acquisitions that allow my company to grow that I hadn't thought about because I wasn't involved in that? And to be able to look around a room or pick up the newspaper and see the names of people that are making big differences in the city of Seattle and around the world and in our community makes a big deal. I mean, Dan Price just with Gravity Payments just had made a big announcement here 10 days ago, I think, if that long ago. And what he made a decision to do is groundbreaking, and that's an EO Seattle member. So that's the kind of individuals that we're looking for. That's the kind of people that we want to be associated with, and it's what makes this organization as powerful as it is.
Dan was on the radio program twice, by the way.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
When he had fewer than 20 employees, but anyway.
Yeah.
Dan's a great guy.
During the break, we started talking about GoPro and Kodak. You brought up. Why don't we go through a little of that?
Yeah. Well, I was relaying the fact that the story with Kodak that you were talking about, and as they missed the boat, a company like GoPro could have been started by two guys in EO like Kevin and I, who, our avid passion was to get out and be outdoors and be active. And Kevin being in the production business and in the film business, might go, hey, it'd be really cool if we could somehow take this camera that is becoming obsolete and turn it into a little video camera, and we'll strap it onto your helmet when we go skiing or whatever. And essentially that's what happened. And what did GoPro do? They took what was, for all intents and purposes, an obsolete technology, found a demographic and a customer base, and they marketed to those guys. And they created, in a 5-year period, a several billion-dollar company. At the same time, Kodak, who's generations old, files for bankruptcy. So it's those kind of ideas and companies and things like that are the kind of things you can stumble across inside of this organization. And it is absolutely overwhelming to be involved around some of the intellectual powers and the people and the thoughts and the comments and the conversations that you can have with people that are constantly thinking about the economy and what's going on in businesses and where they're going and what they're going to do with their organizations and how they're generating wealth and how they're taking care of their community and their employees and all of those things. So,
and I would guess it's also a very good organization for somebody that doesn't have business experience but has some technical or has some interest in a business and needs some real help in becoming a business person rather than just an ideas guy.
Yeah, it definitely positions you to have the support that you need to succeed, and not only from the standpoint of, here's the best way to run a business, but you also have to go through the process yourself and figure out what's right for you. But it definitely gives you insight into how that process might work.
I think it's fascinating. I think it's a tremendous opportunity for Seattle. So if someone wanted to get involved, if they had sales of $1 million and they controlled the company, how would they do that? How would they get a hold of you?
So we have a website, eoseattle.org, lists a lot of details about the organization. There's a form on there that you can submit to get further information. And our membership chair actually reaches out and sets up an interview and walks you through the process of what that looks like. And it kind of goes over and talks to you a little bit more detail about what the experience is and make sure that you feel comfortable with that experience. And then the process is essentially once you qualify through the global process, which we've outlined a little bit earlier, you get interviewed by our board, and the board kind of runs you through some questions, and then you get accepted into the organization.
Well, it's a great organization, and last year Seattle was the fastest growing city in the country and the fastest growing number of business formations last year. So it seems like, I don't know how much you could ascribe to this organization, but certainly a lot has to be ascribed to the jobs that you guys are creating. So thanks.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
We're coming up to another commercial break. Don't go away. I want to talk about this bull market we're having. I believe it's going to go on for a number of years, but it is going to come to an end at some time. I want to talk about what I think could bring it down. So don't go away. We'll be talking about that right after the break.
Stay tuned. About Money returns in a moment with your host, Mike Adams, here on Business Radio 1300 KKOL. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Lots of people manage investment portfolios. Just a few can manage a successful portfolio and provide exceedingly great service to their clients. Here's Mike Adams from Adams Financial Concepts.
We believe the price you pay should be based on the performance of your portfolio and the quality of service you receive.
Mike, it seems that a lot of companies subscribe to the one-size-fits-all mentality of investing. Does one size really fit all?
Not with us. Every portfolio that we manage is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. We place our client's interests first in all portfolio decisions.
If you're looking for a home for your 7-figure plus investment portfolio, call Mike Adams of Adams Financial Concepts, specializing in creating and maintaining wealth for over 20 years. 206-903-1019. That's 206-903-1019. Or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Safety.gov.
We're back with more About Money. For details on what you hear on today's show, visit adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Now, here again is Mike Adams.
So in the first part of the program, I talked about what had gone on and that I feel that we may be on an exponential curve with the stock market. From January 1st, 1900, the Dow stood at 66. In October 29, it had reached almost 400. That was a 7-fold increase in 29 years. In 1941, the Dow stood at 100 and reached 1,000 in 1966. A 25-year period of time, 4 years shorter than before, but it had increased 10 times instead of 7. And from 1982 to 2000, the Dow went from 1,000 to 14,000, a 14-fold increase in 18 years. I believe we may be in a time when we're going to see even a greater than a 14-time increase from 14,000 times 15 or whatever that could get us to over 200,000 in a shorter period of time than 18 years. But at some time, it will come to an end. And I've always wanted to be ahead of what goes on. And I want to enjoy. I want to take advantage of this whole period of time when the Dow is moving up, when the stock market's moving up, when the GDP is moving up. But at some time, it's going to come to an end. And I've given some thought about this to begin to be prepared, to begin to think about what needs to happen. Not this year, not next year, not 5 years from now, but at some time in the future. How will it end? You know, for the people that lived through the Great Depression of 1929, that generation of people, look back on that time and it was so influential in their lives. They knew people who didn't have enough food, who didn't have enough income in their families to buy clothes. They had to buy secondhand clothes. They had to pass clothes down. It had a dramatic effect on families, and it had a dramatic effect for the people that grew up. So much so that when we reached the 1970s, people were willing to deflate or inflate their way out of an economic situation, a very tough economic situation. They were willing to inflate their way out to avoid another depression. And they did that. We went through the 1970s when the interest rates reached 17, 18, 20%. It shut down a lot of the housing market. It shut down a lot of businesses. And during that period of time, we went through what was called stagflation, if you remember that time, where we had a slowing down economy, and yet prices continued to increase as we went through a stagflation time. It wasn't until we raised interest rates under Volcker a great deal that all began to come down. And then after that time, there was a tremendous fear for the people that lived through that great inflationary period of time. There was a fear, and you hear today of people talking about, and the central banks talking about controlling inflation, keeping it below 2%. There's a great fear of printing money, and having inflation take off again, because when you print too much money, it's inflationary. During a time that we went through, the Great Recession that we went through, we needed to print that money, and that needed to take us out of that. But if you do that during good times, it's inflationary. So you hear the central banks, and especially the European Central Bank, talk about not allowing inflation to get above 2%. That goes back to the 1970s and that fear. But as we go forward, as we come out of this time of the Great Recession, the generations that are coming up and the people that have lived through this Great Recession, that will be what influences them the most. A lot of the people that remember the great inflation time, the stagflation time, will have moved out of power. And you'll have people that come into government, into the positions of power, that remember the Great Recession. The number of college kids that moved back home because they couldn't find a job, the number of college kids that had a very tough time finding work, even as a barista in a coffee place, as a waiter in a restaurant. It was a time in which jobs were hard to come by, and they'll remember that. They'll remember the Great Recession time. And what they'll want to do is make sure that we don't go back into a Great Recession time. Now, what causes the Great Recession is a credit crisis. You have to build up a lot of credit. If you go back and you look at 2007, 2008, what had happened before that time is the banks became heavily leveraged, the companies became heavily leveraged, consumers became heavily leveraged. You build up a shadow banking system. You build up all this debt that was overhanging the markets. So when you had a triggering event like the subprime mortgages that started the cycle, everything began to tumble down. If you look at where we are now and where we will be probably in the next 5 or 10 years, we're not increasing our debt levels that great. We're actually moving GDP much faster, and world GDP much faster than we're creating debt. That will have an effect of not putting us back into one of those crisis situations. But what it will do is it will leave free the time for people as they move forward in 10 or 15 or 20 years to remember this Great Recession and the impact it had on lives. And they'll be willing to inflate the way out of an economic time which could lead to a great recession. You know, it's a cyclical kind of thing. It's the pendulum swinging back and forth. People who remembered the Great Depression did not want to go through another depression, and they were willing to inflate their way out of it. People that went through the stagflation, the great inflationary time, did not want to go back through inflation. They were willing to give us a great recession to make sure we didn't have inflation. Now, the pendulum swings the other way. In my opinion, this will all come to an end. This bull market that still has years to go and a long way to go. But I would guess that it will be a stagflation, even worse probably than the one we lived through in the 70s. You know, it's being prepared. The idea is to put you ahead of the curve instead of behind the curve, and I'm way ahead of the curve. So that's where we stand. I want to thank the guests that have been on today, Jim Price and Kevin Mott, Entrepreneurial Organization. And if you have an interest in that, if you're a beginning entrepreneur, if you're an old established entrepreneur, but you've got $1 million in sales and you have a business and you think this is something that could really help you, and it probably can, you should contact the Entrepreneurial Organization through their website and see how it can help. If you missed part of this program or some of the other programs, you can find podcast on the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. And other than that, I hope you have a very good time. I think we have some very, very good times ahead of us in the economy, in business. And I just want to leave one note. I used to be asked to speak every year to Rotary. I gave him a talk in November of 98 saying and make a comparison to Archibald Young and Greenspan and what they were doing. It was a negative talk, and they never invited me to come back again. I hope that's not the case with the radio. Do have a wonderful weekend, because it should be a nice weekend, and maybe the Mariners can win a few games. Have a good weekend. I will be back next week.
You've been listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you want Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared on the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Friday afternoon at 3 for more About Money with Mike Adams, here on Money Radio 1300 KKOL.
The preceding program was sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Lots of people manage investment portfolios. Just a few can manage a successful portfolio and provide exceedingly great service to their clients. Here's Mike Adams from Adams Financial Concepts.
We believe the price you pay should be based on the performance of your portfolio and the quality of service you receive.
You know, Mike, it seems that a lot of companies subscribe to the one-size-fits-all mentality of investing. Does one size really fit all?
Not with us. Every portfolio that we manage is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. We place our client's interests first in all portfolio decisions.
If you're looking for a home for your 7-figure plus investment portfolio, call Mike Adams of Adams Financial Concepts, specializing in creating and maintaining wealth for over 20 years. 206-903-1019. That's 206-903-1019. Or log on to Adams Financial. Following program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concept.